These communications are inscribed in the proposals that we received through the call for papers, and so we're very happy to have these improved contributions to our program. Just something which is more in the organization. I've been told to tell you that tomorrow is very important to get this with you, to get into the museum. So now we can start. My only recommendation is to be strict in time because we are many. So now I invite Llane Fragoso Maldonado, coming from the Freie Universität Berlin. She's going to talk about the Pseudo-Boccaccino de Wilhelm Bode, 1890, la individualización de un pintor desconocido del Renacimiento en el apogeo de la connoisseurship y la disputa por el monopolio interpretativo del arte italiano. Please, Llane.
La investigación de Wilhelm Bode sobre la pintura lombarda de la temprana edad moderna se centra sobre todo en la búsqueda de las huellas de Leonardo en Milán. Ya como jefe del Departamento de Escultura de los Museos Reales de Berlín en 1886, Bode llama la atención sobre un grupo de pinturas que se hallaban en las bodegas del museo relacionadas con la escuela lombarda, las cuales él salva del polvo y del olvido. El estudio extenso y detallado de este grupo de pinturas se había convertido para Bode en una cuestión crucial, ya que éste incluía una resurrección de Cristo con los santos Leonardo y Lucía, el cual un par de años antes declaró como obra del propio Leonardo. La controvertida atribución, defendida obstinadamente por él y que le valió las burlas, en particular de sus colegas italianos, fue superada un siglo más tarde cuando aparece un contrato y una carta admonitoria que atestiguan a Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio y Marco de Ollono, dos cercanos colaboradores en Milán, como los autores de la obra. En cualquier caso, la investigación exhaustiva de Leonardo y de sus seguidores milaneses, por la que incluso Bode emprendió un viaje de estudio a Lombardía en 1885, le llevó a descubrir una personalidad pictórica hasta entonces insospechada, la cual él fundamenta en un artículo de apenas 3 páginas titulado Un maestro anónimo de la antigua escuela lombarda, el Pseudo-Boccaccino. Bode comienza su artículo con la observación de que de todas las escuelas de la pintura italiana, ninguna era tan poco conocida y apenas investigada como la escuela lombarda. Él achaca a la falta de investigación en los archivos el hecho de que muchas obras continuaran sin atribuir o estuvieran atribuidas arbitrariamente a maestros conocidos. Para hacer cara a este escenario, Bode considera que la única tarea que le quedaba a la crítica de arte era agrupar obras de autoría incierta que por sus características estilísticas particulares parezcan proceder de la misma mano. Después, recomienda seleccionar de este grupo una de las obras más sugestivas o significativas y utilizar su tema, una característica o su lugar de exposición para con este denominar al autor de las obras. Nombres convenidos como el maestro de las medias figuras femeninas, el maestro de San Severino o el maestro de la Pasión de Liebesberg fueron creadas bajo este principio. Haciendo uso de este método, Bode reúne un grupo de obras dispersas en galerías, museos e iglesias bajo todo tipo de atribuciones, las cuales le parecen pertenecer a un mismo autor cuyo carácter claramente difería de los demás pintores de la escuela lombarda. Pintura clave de este grupo es un lavatorio en la Galería de la Academia de Venecia, sin firma, pero fechada con el número romano 1500, la cual en ese momento era atribuida al pintor cremonés Boccaccio-Boccaccino. Bode observa discrepancias entre las cualidades del cuadro y las obras del pintor cremonés, observando que el maestro del lavatorio, cito, tiene colores fuertes, ásperos, vivos, drapeados duros que recuerdan algo a los de Perugino, extremidades mal dibujadas, manos largas y estrechas con dedos tan finos como las puntas de un tenedor, fondo negro, tipos copiados de Leonardo. Bode también considera como la obra del pintor anónimo un lienzo de gran formato con una cena en Emmaus. Entonces, en una colección privada de Venecia, que guarda un gran parecido con el lavatorio y que se deja relacionar con la cena de Leonardo. Bode agrupa un total de 11 obras alrededor del pintor anónimo, al que él da el nombre convenido de Pseudo-Boccaccino, en alusión a la atribución vigente en la época de la mayoría de los cuadros, estimando su periodo de actividad entre 1500 y 1510, y aunque seguramente activo en Milán, en algún momento no le parece que proceda de ahí, pues la influencia de la pintura local y de Leonardo solo era superficial. Debido a la orientación de algunos de sus cuadros a la obra de Cima da Conegliano y al Vice Vivarini, sugiere que el pintor debió haber probado suerte también en Venecia. Bode finaliza su artículo deseando el pronto descubrimiento de un cuadro firmado o de un documento que permita identificar al pintor. En la historiografía artística alemana de la época era habitual el uso de nombres convenidos al individualizar artistas anónimos. Bode recomienda esta costumbre en la investigación histórico-artística italiana como una forma de contrarrestar y poner orden al caos que reina en la historia del arte lombarda, confusiones que reinan en la historia del arte lombarda, en sus propias palabras. Este consejo, en apariencia desinteresado, transporta una alusión solo comprensible al considerar que el Pseudo-Boccaccino de Bode aparece en un periodo de la historiografía artística italiana caracterizado por una gran tensión debida sobre todo a la consolidación durante la segunda mitad del siglo XIX de la pintura italiana de la temprana edad moderna como base de importantes colecciones museísticas. Los viajes a Italia que Charles Isleck, Otto Mundla emprenden para la National Gallery de Londres, o Gustav Wagen primero y Wilhelm Bode después para la Gemäldegalerie de Berlín en busca de obras para completar las colecciones de sus respectivos museos, dan fe de la importancia de la tarea. Sus diarios de viaje, en los que registran obras de arte y sus encuentros con coleccionistas y galeristas, dan una idea de lo exaltado del mercado. Además de las restricciones a la exportación de obra artística, a menudo se topan con atribuciones muy optimistas y precios respectivamente altos, o con obras sobrepintadas, retocadas, completadas, o con firmas borradas o falsificadas. Solo en lo que respecta a nuestro pintor, tenemos, por ejemplo, el retrato de un noble, que se encontraba en la colección Castelbarco, atribuida a Rafael, o la cena en Emmaus, antes perteneciente a la colección Cernaiotto, donde estaba atribuida a Leonardo. Es obvio que en semejante área conflictiva la figura del conocedor de arte se convierta en decisiva. En consecuencia, la actividad exigía cada vez menos métodos empíricos y más científicos para proceder sistemáticamente con los objetos y su clasificación. Una de las figuras más influyentes en el discurso histórico del arte de la época fue sin duda Giovanni Morelli, político, médico e historiador del arte, que publicó entre 1870 y 1890 una serie de estudios críticos sobre la pintura italiana bajo el seudónimo de Ivan Lermoliv, con los que se propuso clasificar históricamente las obras italianas anteriores a 1700 con ayuda de un método de atribución desarrollado por él mismo. Como ya se habló del método al principio, el doctor Lorber ya lo mencionó, voy a brincarme este pedazo. El método que Morelli califica de experimental intenta evolucionar la actividad del conocedor del fastidioso diletantismo hacia una verdadera ciencia del arte. En su libro Obras de maestros italianos en las galerías de Múnich, Dresde y Berlín, de 1880, Morelli cuestiona muchas de las atribuciones allí establecidas y mediante comparaciones sistemáticas de detalles emprende su corrección. Aunque muchas de sus atribuciones resultaron acertadas, solo en la Gemäldegalerie de Dresde, un total de 46 cuadros, la actividad de Morelli y su método no contaron con la aprobación unánime. En particular, los directores de museos opusieron resistencia. Su rivalidad con Wilhelm Bode era bien conocida. Bode expresó sus discrepancias con Morelli en numerosas publicaciones, pues tuvo que enfrentarse a regañadientes a la intromisión de Morelli en atribuciones ya muy establecidas. Entre otras cosas, le acusa de haber aumentado la confusión en el campo de la pintura lombarda. Por su parte, Morelli deplora la posición adversa de Bode hacia él en el prefacio de su libro de 1890 sobre las galerías Borghese y Doria Pamphili de Roma, concluyendo que ambos, cito, son por desgracia en todo las antípodas más declaradas. En su autobiografía, publicada en 1930, Bode dedica varias páginas a lo que él llama su lucha contra el método, pues éste le había granjeado el odio y la persecución de los discípulos de Morelli. Él desaprueba la sobrevalorización del método y su aplicación unilateral, pues éstas traían consigo el peligro de producir aún más diletantismo en lugar de combatirlo como supuestamente se pretendía en un principio. Otra razón, seguramente de mayor peso, de las enconadas diferencias entre Bode y Morelli era, como Llane y Anderson pudo demostrar, la dimensión político-cultural del connoisseurship, el cual, en la época de la creación de los museos nacionales, era una importante actividad de diagnóstico que determinaba quién se quedaba con las mejores obras de arte. Bajo la convicción de que con eso se estaba creando el patrimonio futuro de una nación, Anderson destaca la actividad de Morelli como senador del Reino de Italia a partir de 1873, así como su implicación en la política cultural italiana, como el verdadero punto clave de discordia entre él y Bode. El caso más conocido es el intento fallido de Bode de adquirir la Tempestad de Giorgione para la Gemäldegalerie de Berlín. Debido a una prohibición de exportación de 1875 iniciada por Morelli, la obra permaneció en Italia. La disputa entre Bode y Morelli y sus seguidores se apodera también de otros foros. La revista Archivio Histórico del Arte, en la que Bode publica su artículo sobre el Pseudo-Boccaccino, resulta por ello especialmente relevante para nuestro tema. Fundada en 1888 y dirigida por Adolfo Venturi y Domenico Gnoli en Roma, esta publicación se dedicaba principalmente a difundir la investigación histórica sobre el arte italiano. Esto marca el inicio de la Kunstwissenschaft en Italia y surge como respuesta a publicaciones ya establecidas como la Gazette de Beaux-Arts en París, Zeitschrift für Bildende Kunst en Leipzig, Repertorium für Kunstwissenschaft en Berlin und Stuttgart. Durante su corta vida bajo este nombre, Venturi se atrajo la colaboración de historiadores del arte y autores nacionales e internacionales. Eugene Munz, Hugo von Tschudi, Luca Beltrami, Gustavo Frisoni, Wilhelm Bode y otros tantos fueron colaboradores habituales. Pero no todo marchaba bien detrás de la escena. La correspondencia de Adolfo Venturi permite hacerse una idea de la creciente tensión justo después del primer número de la revista, provocada por la participación de autores internacionales. Gustavo Frisoni, uno de los más leales partidarios y amigos de Morelli, presentó una actitud especialmente reacia. En una carta fechada el 23 de marzo de 1888, Frisoni, quien también participó activamente en el ámbito de la legislación italiana sobre la protección de bienes culturales, reclama a Venturi la contratación de tantos autores extranjeros para la revista. Sus principales argumentos contra los colegas internacionales eran una supuesta falta de dominio de la lengua italiana, un comportamiento intrusivo y una falta de intuición. Sus ataques iban principalmente dirigidos contra Bode. La atribución de la resurrección de Cristo de la Gemäldegalerie a Leonardo le parece a Frisoni prueba suficiente de la incompetencia de Bode. La descalificación de Frisoni a sus colegas internacionales pretende, por razones obvias, reservar a los italianos la soberanía de la interpretación sobre el arte italiano, al menos en los foros italianos. Esta actitud no pasó desapercibida para los interesados. Bode se quejaba de la forma en que Frisoni entrelazaba el fanatismo del método de Morelli con la llama nacionalista. Después de un largo problema entre Bode y Venturi, porque Bode no quería publicar la obra porque tenía miedo de que los seguidores de Morelli le hicieran la guerra, finalmente llegan a un acuerdo. Y el artículo sobre el Pseudo-Boccaccino aparece en el tercer número de la edición de 1890. Bode esboza en este, a partir de los 11 cuadros reunidos, el perfil de un pintor anónimo que sigue siendo válido en la mayoría de sus aspectos hoy en día, abarcando su periodo creativo en la transición del 400 al 500, sus orígenes lombardos, su actividad en Milán y Venecia. Contrario a los temores de Bode, el pintor anónimo fue bien recibido por aliados y adversarios. En el contexto de la discusión sobre los métodos de atribución, la individualización del Pseudo-Boccaccino aparece como un ejemplo paradigmático con el que Bode quería presentar la crítica estilística tradicional como más fiable que el método fisionómico de Morelli. Además, puede verse como una contribución deliberada a la demostración de su pericia en pintura italiana y, no menos importante, como una decidida réplica a la soberanía interpretativa sobre el arte italiano reclamada por algunos colegas italianos. Muchas gracias.
We have Louis Pasteur and the origins of the interdisciplinary study of painting at the École de Beaux-Arts in Paris. Pauline Deschamps-Kahn and Christopher Bakke come from Paris, from the École Pratique des Études. Please.
Well, good afternoon. Today we would like to talk about a figure that may be an unexpected name when discussing the scientific study of art, and that name is Louis Pasteur. You will all, of course, be aware of Pasteur as the inventor of the food preservation process, which bears his name, pasteurization. You will also know that Pasteur is a foundational figure in public health, having developed the first laboratory-produced vaccines and being the father of modern germ theory. What few of you may be aware of is that Pasteur was also briefly a professor between 1864 and 1867 at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He held a post created especially for him, Chair of Geology, Physics, and Applied Chemistry. Modern biographies of Pasteur ignore this chapter of his career entirely, but it's an understandable oversight, given that Pasteur taught at the Beaux-Arts before he became a widely influential scientist. By the 1860s, Pasteur was just at the early stages of his work on fermentation and pasteurization. And although this was a central focus of Pasteur's work at this time, his notebooks preserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France show that during this period, he hardly neglected his role as a professor at the École. In fact, in the archive at the BNF, we see that he devoted meticulous work to the study of art, especially painting. The vast majority of this 900-page manuscript has never been published, and this is what Pauline and I would like to share with you today. In the notebooks, we see that Pasteur assumed his role as a professor of the science of art by familiarizing himself with the foundational French texts of technical art history, including, for example, Anne-Claude de Caylus and Léonore Mérimée. His notes include extensive quotations from these works, as well as his own comments. Also preserved are Pasteur's handwritten lectures, which he delivered at the Beaux-Arts. Pauline will soon discuss Pasteur's lectures on painting from his second year of lessons. But here, I'm showing you a page from Pasteur's inaugural lecture in February 1864, in which he puts forward a vision for the study of science within the arts. His goal, he says, is the application of science for the sake of an artistic result. However, the realization of this artistic goal is best achieved by the application of knowledge gained through scientific study. He encourages his students to learn more than the mere technique of their art and to also master the science that informs the technique. Whereas, he says, technique can be tedious, scientific laws are beautiful, and they will lead to greater artistic possibilities. In the same lecture, we also see the first mention of what is one of the core themes of Pasteur's teaching, which is the necessity of a laboratory in order to study the science of art. During his brief tenure, Pasteur will implore the École to provide him with proper space and equipment in order to teach what he called the most ordinary physical and chemical phenomena. Pasteur even complains to his students about the bureaucratic delays in establishing a lab and laments postponing the teaching of certain applied sciences. A lab in which the science of art can be observed will be one of the legacies of Pasteur's short time at the Beaux-Arts. Now, I would like to address what is really, in my opinion, the most fascinating aspect of Pasteur's notebooks, which is that they contain extensive observations of, and even interviews with, contemporary French painters, artisans, and restorers. Some of the figures with whom Pasteur recorded conversations include the architect Félix Dubon, the painter Tony Robert Fleury and Alexandre Leroy, as well as the principal restorer at the Musée du Louvre, Félix Briotet, and the director of National Museums in France, Frédéric Rézé. These investigations in the field, so to speak, are valuable historical documents for two reasons. The first is that they offer a glimpse into the working mind of Pasteur. For example, from Alexandre Leroy, Pasteur commissioned a portrait of his daughter Cécile, and he records its execution over 8 days. Pasteur makes detailed notes about the drying times of various colors and pigments. Although he makes note of Leroy's own experience of drying times, Pasteur insists on touching the painting himself in order to evaluate to what degree a painted surface has dried. On another occasion, Pasteur was speaking with Félix Briotet, the restorer at the Louvre. Briotet makes several statements that would make any conservator wince today. For instance, he tells Pasteur that the color of a painting's preparation layer has no effect on the preservations of the colors of the painting's final pictorial surface. Pasteur, needless to say, writes that he cannot agree with Briotet's statement. The second reason why Pasteur's notebooks are such a rich document is that they offer a vibrant panorama of the daily life of the artist in mid-19th century Paris. For example, Robert Fleury tells Pasteur that the best restorer of old master paintings is one Monsieur Arnaud on the Rue Bonaparte. So what does Pasteur do? He goes to Arnaud's studio, acquires several different color pigments, which he then mixes in poppy oil, and over the course of 1 month, Pasteur applies them to canvas and observes their drying speed and records them in his manuscript. One of the artists who appears regularly in recorded conversations is Hippolyte Flandrin. We learn from Pasteur that for his frescoes at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Flandrin procured his colors from a pharmacist named Monsieur Duroisier, located at Place Saint-Michel. Flandrin's mural paintings were recently restored in 2019 by Emily Chacrun and Agatha Grazik, with whom we are very lucky to be in touch for our research. They have informed us that the frescoes were indeed made with a mix of wax and oil, without varnish, and that they were very well conserved, especially in the portions executed exclusively in wax. The painter was engaged in a broader movement which showcased the rediscovered techniques of antiquity, hence this mix of wax and oil that allowed for superior conservation of mural paintings in a dark and humid environment like Saint-Germain. It is really this rich collection of tiny technical details that I think makes Pasteur's notebooks such an insightful source for those who study 19th century French art. And now that I've described the contents of the notebooks, I'll let Pauline discuss Pasteur's lectures and their influence.
As Chris was saying, I will concentrate on the second year of courses given by Pasteur at the École des Beaux-Arts. At the beginning of the year 1865, Louis Pasteur undertook 6 lessons across 6 weeks that explored the material nature of oil paint. He discussed everything from its earliest known uses to its widespread adoption in Europe, and finally its conservation. The manuscript conserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France contains Pasteur's commentary on his class notes, such as, "Good lesson, these pages are too scientific for these young people," or don't let yourself repeat if you see a few faces that seem not to understand. Speak for the best. For this brief talk, we have chosen to focus on the first and the fifth lessons, which we find particularly interesting since they contain an approach similar to those of museum labs today. The first lesson is a general presentation on the theme of his courses, devoted to the material nature of painting in oil, especially the oils, the varnishes, and their support and preparation. From his very first words, Louis Pasteur expresses his dismay not to have at his disposition an amphitheater and a lab appropriate for the teaching of chemistry and physics applied to the fine arts. Pasteur often calls attention to this point. For Pasteur, the lab was indispensable. Regarding the date of the discovery of painting in oil, Louis Pasteur disagrees with Jean-François Léonard Mérimée and the interpretation that he proposed in his work De la peinture à l'huile, which Pasteur initially describes, as you can see on the slide, as a très bon ouvrage, which Pasteur, as a très bon ouvrage or a very good work, before reconsidering his first impression and then crossing out the word trait. A few lines later, Pasteur writes that Mérimée made conjectures rather than research. Again, he crosses out the superlative trait before the words bien écrit et bien composé, written and composed. While Mérimée maintains that Van Eyck deserves the merit of first discovering the technique of painting in oil, Louis Pasteur says that this is a poor interpretation of original sources, particularly of Cennino Cennini. According to Mérimée, Cennino would never have put into practice the method of oil painting that he describes in his Libro dell'Arte. Instead, he was simply describing Van Eyck's technical process. Louis Pasteur concludes his interpretation of Mérimée by saying, in his case, there exists nothing but proof of doubt for those who want to doubt the truth, like Monsieur Mérimée. Louis Pasteur wants especially to draw the attention of his students to the enormous importance of material method in oil painting, as well as to an understanding of the materials and components available to the painter. Pasteur demonstrates the importance of the science of chemistry for paintings, as well as how chemistry permits the painter to distinguish the qualities and the defects of the ingredients upon which painters depend, and to understand their physical and chemical properties. In his fifth lecture, Louis Pasteur explores the gradual darkening of oil paint, in particular examining its cause or causes. He cites the example of Perugino, Vierge à l'Enfant, conserved at the Musée du Louvre. He said to his students, voyez par exemple dans le salon carré un tableau du Pérugin, la Vierge tenant l'enfant Jésus, adoré par 2 saints et 2 anges. L'éclat des teintes est vraiment admirable. The brilliance of the color tones is truly admirable. Although this work has been subject to conservation and restoration at the Centre de recherche et de restauration des Musées de France, no physical-chemical analyses have yet been undertaken in order to understand the truly admirable color tints underscored by Pasteur. Later, in this lesson, we see an empirical approach that resembles what we find in museum laboratories today. While examining the true nature of the darkening of oil paintings, Pasteur poses the question, is it really the oil that darkens? Pasteur demonstrates that linseed oil and poppy oil whiten when they are exposed to air and to light. Pasteur arrives at 2 conclusions. 1, oil is the cause of the darkening of oil paint. 2, however, it is not the oil itself that darkens. To conclude, Louis Pasteur's aspiration was that his teaching, as well as his call for scientific labs, will benefit the preventive conservation of artistic patrimony. By stressing the union of historical, scientific, and technical expertise towards the common goal of conservation and restoration, he hoped that these different disciplines would serve works of art. Less than 60 years after Louis Pasteur held the chair of applied science at the École des Beaux-Arts, on the 15th of October 1931, the Institute for the Scientific Study of Painting at the Musée du Louvre was created, commonly called the Menini Institute, after the name of its co-founder, Carlos Menini. The Dr. Fernando Pérez, the second founder, proposed to establish at the Louvre a scientific method of study dedicated particularly to the examination of the construction of paintings. For Pérez, la conservation préventive was essential to the durability of works of art, and we cannot preserve art without, I quote, the collaboration between science and art, which now must no longer live in isolation from one another. Thank you.
Thank you. Now is the turn of Nathael Cano, and he's a restorer in la Escuela de Conservación y Restauración de Occidente. He's going to present las ciencias que se cultivan en el museo, alcances y pormenores de los estudios técnicos en el Museo Nacional, Ciudad de México, 1900-1910.
De antemano agradezco la oportunidad de presentar este trabajo de archivo y también felicitaciones a los organizadores por tener este encuentro y poder discutir este tema. Entablar una discusión sobre el origen de los estudios científicos en el arte es relevante por los numerosos autores que han destacado la importancia y aportación sobre el conocimiento tejido por estas disciplinas, como lo es historia del arte, ciencia y conservación. En México, el análisis de los archivos del Museo Nacional de Arqueología, Historia y Etnografía de la Ciudad de México, resguardados por el Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia y el Archivo General de la Nación, nos permiten comprender este contexto en la primera década del siglo XX. El Museo Nacional, inaugurado en 1825, concebido como una institución pública, es precursora de las disciplinas que hoy conforman la historia, la arqueología, la conservación y la museología en mi país, además de un instrumento social ideado para la legitimación del Estado y la creación de un sentimiento nacionalista, fomentado y acrecentado por el gobierno de Porfirio Díaz a finales desde el siglo XIX. Entre fichas técnicas, los informes de investigación, fotografías, el trabajo curatorial de las colecciones, pictóricas y arqueológicas, destaca el ensayo La química como auxiliar de las ciencias que se cultivan en nuestro museo, desarrollado en 1905 por los conservadores, profesores y agentes culturales Genaro García y Manuel Urbina Altamirano para el Museo Nacional. Es una publicación póstuma para 1910. Manuel Urbina murió en 1907 y con la cual tuvo un también trabajo de precisión sobre las fechas de cuándo pudo haber sido consultado y aplicado este documento. En él se muestran las agudas discusiones sobre el pasado de la nación mexicana y las relaciones de estos profesionistas con los trabajos de arqueología, conservación e historia. Y por supuesto, muestra una compleja relación de los museos de historia e historia natural de Estados Unidos, Inglaterra y Francia. En Genaro García, por ejemplo, precursor también de la disciplina histórica en México, jurista y director del Museo Nacional desde 1905 hasta aproximadamente 1913, impulsó la renovación del plan de investigación marcado por el pensamiento positivista, una preocupación por darle un carácter profesional y científico a la institución, una nueva catalogación basada en los periodos políticos del país y la preservación de las colecciones que se incrementaron en aquellos años. Ya en el reglamento se establecía que el conservador del museo debía defender el carácter científico de esta institución. Abro comillas, se reunirá y conservará en él, para uso del público, cuanto pueda dar el más exacto conocimiento del país en orden a su población, origen y progresos en ciencias y artes, religión y costumbres de sus habitantes, producciones naturales y propiedades de su suelo y clima. Con esta dupla, vemos cómo Genaro García en realidad desarrolló un complejo sistema de producción desde el Museo Nacional, apoyado por los profesores que estaban encargados de las cátedras de Historia Natural, Arqueología e Historia. En específico, Manuel Urbina, biólogo y jurista, vislumbra el trabajo de los estudios de las colecciones desde la historia y su confrontación con los resultados de las ciencias exactas, como la biología, la química, entre otras. Vemos que en su pensamiento ocupan las ciencias en una escala de conocimientos humanos, compara y relaciona con otras bibliografías y, de cierta manera, como una taxonomía, define en sus cátedras lo que para él deben ser estos estudios. Las ciencias físicas son especialmente de observación y, aunque están subordinadas a la materia, el adelanto y el progreso científico las conducen al camino de la emancipación, estableciendo leyes independientes de la observación y experimentación. Es así como abre su cátedra en este ensayo. El hombre, no por un egoísmo particular, sino por la necesidad de conocerse mejor, se ha visto obligado a hacer su propio estudio. La antropología, con sus grandes capítulos, arqueología, historia, música o bellas artes, lo estudia desde el punto de vista del progreso, civilización e industria. Y precisamente con la química, hoy con leyes precisas e invariables, aplicadas a los cuerpos por medio de los análisis, nos dan, curiosamente como hoy pensaríamos describir un espectro, una ficha signalética de cada uno de ellos, para que en un momento dado puedan caracterizarse por medio de sus constantes físico-químicas. Es interesante leer este ensayo porque sigue bajo una retórica defendiendo argumentos de cómo este tipo de estudios pueden relacionarse para identificar la edad o la materialidad de los objetos que se están reuniendo en el museo. Y por supuesto relaciona lo que está leyendo de los resultados, por ejemplo, del Museo Británico de Londres, en el cual prescribe que cada jefe de departamento debe conocer la parte química que se relaciona con su especialidad. Mientras que en el Museo del Instituto Smithsoniano, una sección especial de química analítica anexa a los departamentos de geología y mineralogía lo que deben de saber cuando deben hacer investigaciones de autentificación. El laboratorio de química mejor montado en estos establecimientos, según él, en aquella época, es sin duda el que existe en el Museo de Historia Natural de París, donde se han educado algunos de los más eminentes químicos del mundo. Nimio sería de tratar que la historia natural le es indispensable el auxilio de la química y la geología. Una vez que determina el estudio de la región, emprende el estudio químico de ella, investiga la composición química, los elementos constituyentes de las diversas capas que la constituyen en su distribución. Muchas veces, como él ejemplifica, se llega al conocimiento de esta composición por el estudio comparativo, bajo el microscopio y en láminas de rocas. Pero es indispensable confirmar este conocimiento por medio de las reacciones químicas, es decir, la microquímica, un material y un efecto de un análisis destructivo. En específico, cosa análoga se puede decir de la mineralogía. La cristalografía se llega en la mayoría de los casos a suponer y hasta afirmar qué clase de mineral es el que se observa, pero la intervención química se llegará a la más completa certidumbre. Para demostrar lo útil que sería la investigación química en las demás ciencias que se cultivan en nuestro Museo Nacional, él menciona algunos ejemplos con los cuales se está enfrentando al ser perito historiador de esta institución, y el cual también los voy a anunciar. Comenzaremos por la aplicación de la química legal a los manuscritos, que ya con el carácter de auténticas, como documentos históricos, son alterados con el ánimo de cometer un fraude. Se está definiendo los documentos virreinales y, por supuesto, a los códices coloniales. Supongamos que un individuo presenta un manuscrito que dice ser de la época inquisitorial. Dicho documento está hábilmente falsificado. La letra, el estilo, el papel, todo parece corresponder a la época susodicha. El historiador ya ha verificado toda clase de pruebas paleográficas, históricas, etc. El texto corresponde a los hechos relatados. No encuentra anacronismos. En fin, por los medios que están a su alcance, ha llegado a un acuerdo perfecto entre los hechos y sus ideas. Pero el químico, lo señala con total mayúscula, viniendo en su ayuda, raspa un punto, una coma, un fragmento de letra. Y sujeta de esta partícula al examen microquímico, resulta que la tinta usada en la escritura es de base de anilina. Adiós autenticidad del documento, adiós estudio histórico. Ya se podrá decir que se trata de una hábil copia de un hecho histórico o no, pero la escritura es moderna y con la ayuda de una base comparada de química se puede fijar hasta la edad probable del descubrimiento de la anilina y entonces decir que la escritura ha sido verificada de tal día a la fecha en que fue entregado el documento. Por otro lado, en cuanto a los códices, un buen día el arqueólogo manda un ejemplar al químico cuestionando ¿de qué está hecho el papel? ¿Qué clase de pintura fue usada en los jeroglíficos? El químico procede a tomar un pequeñísimo fragmento, lo lleva al microscopio y después de algunas reacciones, determina que el papel no es análogo al usado en otros códices y que la pintura son lacas solubles y no de bases naturales, sino de procedencia sintética. Asume Como los códices están hechos de papel de fibra de maguey y pintados con colores minerales insolubles que proporcionaba la naturaleza a los antiguos mexicanos, ya se podrá asegurar, basados en un hecho científico, que el ejemplar en estudio es falso y el arqueólogo se evita todo trabajo ulterior de investigación. Casos de investigación científica muy curiosos se deben a la química. Muchos casos de química legal, como él lo define, podrán ser citados, tratándose de auxiliar a los museos. Se podría escribir un extenso diccionario de alteraciones y falsificaciones, pero para terminar, citaremos un caso como conclusión de lo que frecuentemente se presentó entre esa primera década. Y, por supuesto, como prueba tan patente, el perito historiador ya no tiene que someterse al rudo trabajo de investigación documental, aparentemente. A partir de la revisión de los archivos y las publicaciones de estos agentes sociales, se pudo entrever que el enfoque técnico-material ha formado parte de los métodos de estudio de las obras y la profesionalización académica de diversas disciplinas, que en su momento se vinculó con las academias de Estados Unidos, de Inglaterra y de Francia. En estos expedientes se pudo entrever que el interés por la técnica y los materiales de las obras también iniciaron con la profesionalización en historia del arte, arqueología y conservación, para explicar los objetos reunidos en los primeros museos. El Museo Nacional, comparándose con la infraestructura y los procesos de estudio de las secciones químicas de estos espacios, intentaron hacer una clasificación científica y disciplinar desde la biología, la geología, respecto a la naturaleza, además de la antropología, con sus grandes capítulos como la arqueología y la historia. Es decir, que el estudio y clasificación del hombre desde el punto de vista del progreso, civilización e industria tenía en cuenta el uso de la química para identificar los elementos constituyentes de los materiales que componen las fibras en un documento o tela, el origen vegetal, animal o mineral de una pintura y su aglutinante, e incluso la composición de un modelado de estuco, una escultura realizada a partir de cerámica o toba volcánica. Con tal consideración de certidumbre y crítica sobre el resultado de las reacciones químicas que presentaban las muestras de estos materiales y su contraste, al parecer, con referencias establecidas, este autor, como el museo en ese periodo, tuvo una garantía suficiente para tomar en cuenta las verdades obtenidas por medio de sus estudios, cuyo objetivo primordial quedó subrayado en la distinción de la obra original sobre la falsificación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. As the turn of Arjan de Komen, a technical art historian at the University of Amsterdam, is going to talk about the Netherlands, the eye against chemistry, technical studies in the Netherlands in the 20s and 30s. Thank you to come.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Anna. The notorious unmasking of the Vermeer forgeries of Han van Meegeren, right after the Second World War, is often held to be the key moment in which Dutch connoisseurship, specifically, and the discipline of art history at large, was dethroned by technical studies. The international fascination for the affair and the publication in English of the scientific examinations by Paul Koremans, propagating the accomplishments of his Brussels Central Laboratory, have certainly helped to frame it as a turning point. And this historiographical scheme also seems to be confirmed by the fact that post-war academic art history distanced itself even more from connoisseurship. And if issues of attribution were at stake, the idea prevailed that only technical examinations could prevent pitfalls, such as those faced with the false Vermeers, a belief that most of the time turned out to be too optimistic. Today we are together to provide a more nuanced version of the developments of technical studies in the pre-war period. In the Netherlands, technical studies developed not so much within the museums, but rather as a side product, you might even say collateral damage, of the art trade, which enjoyed golden years in this period, and of course, especially when authenticity issues were at stake. More than 20 years before Van Meegeren, there had been another affair in Holland that ended in the courtroom. It also severely damaged connoisseurial reputation, and it resulted in a harsh confrontation between connoisseurship and applied chemistry. I present it today as it illustrates the beginning of shifting disciplinary positions, and because it worked, I believe, as an incentive for technical studies. In April 1933, a painting appeared at the market of a laughing cavalier in the style of Frans Hals, the painter of the loose brush that was in those days, next to Rembrandt, as popular as Vermeer is today. It was brought to Cornelis Hofstede de Groot, the greatest expert of Dutch painting alive, renowned for his 10 volumes of Verzeichnis der Werke of the Dutch school, in which, in 1910, he had listed the complete oeuvre of 47 paintings of Frans Hals. Convinced as he was, he made a certificate. The painting was bought by a certain Mr. de Haas, who offered it at the auction house Frederick Muller & Co. in Amsterdam, the director of which was so impressed that he bought it for the firm. Despite the verdict of Hofstede de Groot, serious doubts raised about its authenticity. Yet Mr. de Haas did not want to buy back his painting, and therefore the auction house started a civil case against him at the end of 1924. The court in The Hague nominated the directors of the National Gallery in London and the Mauritshuis as experts. Frans Scheffer, a professor of analytical chemistry from the Technical University of Delft, was added to this team. The first time in the Netherlands that scientific expertise was invited. Scheffer was assisted by a 24-year-old student named Martin de Wild. His name is already mentioned today, coming from a family of conservators with international clientele. The chemical examinations of Scheffer and his student revealed that the blue pigment was cobalt and the white paint samples contained zinc, and that the paint was soluble in water because the medium was gelatin-based instead of oil, for short, a modern fake. Also, Hofstede de Groot was called in to testify, yet he persisted in his opinion. Before the case was closed, he decided to buy the incriminated painting himself in order to prove his unaltered belief in his own attribution. This could have put the affair to sleep, but Hofstede de Groot was not in pursuit of quietness. He wanted the dispute to go on. In 1925, he published a booklet with the alarmist title, True or False, I or Chemistry. In this, he openly ridiculed the connoisseurial qualities of the two museum directors and also refuted, a bit less triumphantly, the validity of Scheffer's findings. The main point was that the chemist had not observed that the tests were done in areas that were recently restored, and that the suspect's solubility of the paint was due to a secret softening recipe invented by the same restorer. Moreover, he believed zinc could already have been around before it was industrially produced. Hofstede de Groot had written a long letter to Scheffer to explain all this, printed in extenso in the booklet, concluding that his observations are insufficient proof of recent manufacture, although he had to admit that he had no refutation of the presence of cobalt blue. The chemist responded as short as possible and said bluntly, "Your stance is so subjective that it is fruitless to enter with you into a discussion about a chemical issue." It certainly stirred up the connoisseur's anger. His pamphlets argue strongly, not without eloquence, against the upcoming role of science in the art. We, in hindsight, can see it as a desperate attempt to push back an upcoming field that was intruding his exclusive domain. The title, I or Chemistry, was chosen to reveal an absurdity, underscored by Hofstede de Groot with the rhetorical question, what has the test tube to do with art? Yet, unintentionally, the title also imprinted the idea that chemistry could be an alternative way to study artworks. It contained as such an invitation, Hofstede de Groot constantly challenges the chemists to deliver proof of the interpretation of the results. Martin de Wild, it seems, felt addressed. He realized that pigment studies needed to rely on a larger corpus of references. So he investigated more than 300 Dutch and Flemish paintings and took samples for chemical testings and microscopic inspection. It was to become his dissertation in chemistry, defended in June 28 in Delft with Scheffer as his superior. It is the first conservator with a PhD in the Netherlands, and I wonder how many other restorer chemists with this degree were around at the time. His dissertation is a state-of-the-art overview of the chemistry of historical pigments. Besides, there is a chapter on conservation techniques, in which a Patent-Covens varnish regeneration technique is critically reviewed and testings of wax and glue linings are presented. Furthermore, he discusses the possibility of X-rays and UV. It certainly was a contribution of importance. Soon to be translated in English, the scientific examinations of pictures in 1929, and in German, Naturwissenschaftlichen Gemäldeuntersuchung in 1931. In a review in the Technische Mitteilungen für Malerei, the book was praised by Heinrich Trillich as a Markstein. Other chemists had before him. He refers to their works and sometimes criticizes them. Think of Arthur Church, the first chemist at the Royal Academy, or Alexander Eibner from the Versuchanstalt in Munich, the ophthalmologist Rehlmann from Weimar, who developed into a paint and color scientist, of course, Arthur Laurie, but also he refers to the Americans Maximilian Toch, however you pronounce it, and more recent Frederick Weber. The work of Gattens was not there yet, as he started at the FOC in exactly the year of de Wild's dissertation. The research of these predecessors was often for the benefit of the practice of painting. De Wild serves above all scientific fact, always being very precise about physico-chemical characteristics. Earlier books were hardly illustrated. Arthur Laurie had introduced the chronological pigment chart, referring to the chronology of entries in literary sources, very much in the Merrifield Eastlake tradition. De Wild's one is a bit larger and is more empiricist because the dots indicating the findings of these pigments in dated oils can be seen. It reminds actually of Laurie's dots in his investigations of illuminated manuscripts. Also, his 30 photographs through the microscope of pigment particles are remarkable. 14 years earlier, Rehlmann had hard-to-read graphic images of crystalline structures. So compare at the left, de Wild, and at the right, the small illustrations of Rehlmann. De Wild, still young, also participated as one of the 2 Dutch participants at the Conference of Rome in October 1930. Scheffer was also to come, but did not in the end. That might be the reason that de Wild spoke about restoration issues instead of his chemical work. And over there he joined several international committees. In 1932 he was invited at a notorious trial in Berlin of Otto Wagner, who had sold about 30 Van Gogh forgeries. He delivered the pigment examinations that proved, at least for some, their inauthenticity. Here we see him between the chemist and the director of the Berlin museums. The other younger yet balding man is Helmut Ruhrmann in his last Berlin year, as we realize now. The photograph illustrates de Wild's place in the international circle of technical studies. We know he had many international contacts, while he always remained an independent restorer and technical researcher in The Hague, not connected to a museum or institution. Yet in 1938 he joined the art history department at Utrecht to teach painting techniques. He did so in the capacity of privaatdocent, a part-time academic position often chosen for new areas in the scientific spectrum, Tomorrow, Sven Dupré will tell you more about it. For now, I imagine that Martin must have realized at that moment that he was about to continue something that his late uncle Karel de Wilde had started 17 years earlier. Karel had left the Netherlands in 1911 for the US when Martin was still a child. In New York, he worked for the important collectors and museums and gained such a reputation that the University of Pennsylvania hired the Dutch restorer to design and teach a 2-year program in technical studies, so even before Forbes' famous Egg and Plaster classes. As can be learned, as can be learned from the American Art News of May 1921, it was dedicated to the history, composition, and properties of pigments, to other painting materials, and to a third category called picture hygiene, object care, we would say nowadays. According to this announcement, it was, quote, not only unique in the United States, but in the whole world. Remarkably, we also read in this text, the suitability of Karel is explained by the fact that he had the benefit, quote, of association of Dr. Hofstede de Groot. Indeed, it had been the same Hofstede de Groot in his capacity as vice director of the Mauritshuis that sent the young artist, Karel de Wilde in 1895 to Vienna and to Alois Hauser Jr. in Berlin in order to learn the art of conservation. Unfortunately, Karel became ill and died in the first year of his course, which brought to the Philadelphia Initiative an end. Martin was to stay for 9 years at Utrecht University. He quitted when he was in the midst of the Van Meegeren inquiry. He was among the 3 investigators of the scientific committee, together with Paul Koremans and Wibo Vroentjes of the National Police Investigation Agency. Here, at this photograph, 2 famous Englishmen are visiting to discuss the scientific interpretation. Generally, Koremans is believed to be the leading man because of his book and is renowned as the director of the Kik Earpa. But from the account of Vroentjes, it can be learned that it was rather de Wilde that played a decisive role in delivering the proof of forgery. Koremans interpreted the radiographs, but relied on this on the help of George Stout and Alan Burroughs, as Francesca Buer discovered in the archive of the Harvard Museums. I mention this for the sake of historiography. It was not that connoisseurship of the eye was still reigning undisturbed till Van Meegeren made himself heard, nor that the young Belgian was the herald of chemistry. But why is it necessary to make this point? Well, what typifies the Dutch story is that it relied very much on this one individual, Martin de Wilde, who worked in his own private firm. In these years, no research center was founded to operate on a larger scale and diffuse and collect expertise. The establishment of the Centraal Laboratorium in Amsterdam still had to wait till 1962. From what I understood of its history, that lasted till the 1990s, it had the greatest difficulty to realize the ideals of interdisciplinary collaboration that the Institute preached. As scientists and conservators, together with a few art historians, had fallen into opposing camps that once again seemed to fight over the slogan, "I or chemistry." And this is the more unfortunate since we have seen today how I and chemistry were perfectly unified in the professional persona of Martin de Wilde. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arjen. Now is the turn of Camille Polkovnik. She comes from the Hamilton Care Institute, University of Cambridge, and she's going to talk about a focus on Stanley Kennedy North, early bridging of technical analysis and conservation, focus on Stanley Kennedy North, 1887-1942, artist, restorer, and scientist. Please, Camille.
Good afternoon. I've been working on Stanley Kennedy North since 2019, when I found his name in a report while I was doing research at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. North was working on two of the most important paintings in Samuel Courtauld's collection, and I'd never heard of him, and I thought, this is a bit odd. And the more I researched him, the more I found him to be a very interesting character. So today I want to give you an overview of his life and career. I will start by giving you a brief overview of North's life and career, and then I will focus on three aspects which I thought were particularly relevant to this conference. The first one is his involvement with X-rays. The second one, his involvement with the 1930 Rome Conference. And the third one is about certain aspects of his conservation career. Those who fall in love with practice without science are like a sailor who enters a ship without a helm or a compass, and who never can be certain whither he is going. This is by Leonardo da Vinci, and I found it in a short book written by North in 1937, towards the end of his career. I think it gives you a really good idea of the kind of conservator and scientist he was, someone with a curious yet logical mind. North was born in 1887 in the United Kingdom. He studied design at the Kensington Royal College of Art in London under Professor William Letherby, who was probably North's first conservation influence. North worked as an artist, designer, art critic until the late 1920s, when he started getting known as a scientist or expert at this, as they said. In parallel, North worked as a paintings conservator, working on many prestigious paintings, mostly in London-based collections. His career in conservation and science slowed down in the late 1930s, and then he died in 1942 in London. And you can see there's this very small pink rectangle at the ends with orchids and flax. And so when he retired from conservation, he actually studied linen and tried to grow flax in order to produce better canvases. And then he wrote a few odd articles on orchids. I want to say a few words about the importance of perspective. This is something that I found very important while I was doing this research in the past. I'm sure many of you have seen these images of people taking pictures of themselves and pretending they were traveling. And I laughed a lot when these came out, but I think they're a perfect example of the importance of perspective and context in order to interpret images and written sources appropriately. In the case of this research, it's important to keep in mind that, first, the career we're examining is rooted in the UK in the 1920s and 1930s. Second, I'm a paintings conservator, and this influences, in a major way, the way I interpret research. And third, the perspective of written sources. Some of the information I'm sharing today came from published articles by North himself, but much came from newspapers and other people's accounts of events. We all know that social media, like Instagram and Facebook, tells you one side of the story, and it's usually the pretty side, so I think it's something to keep in mind. These are a few examples of North's work as an artist. He was greatly inspired and influenced by art from the Middle Ages, and this is very obvious from his work. He had a particular interest in stained glass and also produced manuscript illuminations, paintings, and even maps. I should stress this is only a small slice of North's work as an artist, and I don't have time to show a lot more today. In 1928, North published his first article in the newspaper, The Observer, in which he discusses X-ray and how they can be used on paintings to detect forgeries. This is a very different article from the ones that he published before then, when he worked as an art critic and discussed exhibitions and artists. A year later, North takes it a step further and demonstrates the use of X-rays to the press in his own studio in London. A year later, 1930, North publishes his very first article in the respected Burlington magazine for connoisseurs, this time explaining how X-rays can be used to help understand how paintings are made. North had a very particular relationship with the press. I found a lot of information in the newspapers of the time. I wonder if it comes from his background as an art critic and the relationship he had with publishers, but I think a lot of it comes from his confidence and the desire to share his work with a wider audience. On this slide, you see images which constituted a full page in the Sphere magazine in 1929, and these were taken by a journalist who had been invited to what was described as a radiology tea, which is essentially an afternoon tea party with X-rays. In the first two images, you see North examining a painting very comfortably on his couch, and in the third one, you can see him setting up his X-ray machine. And the machine was described in the newspaper article as, I quote, a new all-British machine, the only one of its kind in England, specially designed for his work and made for him in London, end of quote. It had a much lower voltage of 30,000 as opposed to the usual 60 to 80,000 used in the medical field. And my favorite part, North was described in 1929 in The Observer as the inventor of X-rays. I think we know that this is not really true. But I think he was probably one of the rare providers of this service in London. And I think Anna showed this morning that the Courtauld was 1931 and then National Gallery in 1934. So North was the one doing the work, for the National Gallery. And he was probably the only one. And here are some of the paintings that were X-rayed by North, and you can see the Wilton diptych, which is in the National Gallery. And this one, the Lenain brothers, which is at Petworth House, part of the National Trust, was X-ray, and he even wrote an article on it in Burlington magazine, mostly about the Pentimento. In 1930, North attended the Rome Conference. His talk was entitled Quelques problèmes de restauration et de conservation des peintures, which means a few issues in the restoration and conservation of paintings, but I'm not sure if he actually gave the talk in French. Many of the papers were then published in Museo, which is a French magazine on museology, but North's article was not in the papers. And then the book was published in 1940, but it does not feature personal contributions because this was an attempt to highlight the collaborative aspect of this conference and the book. However, a journalist from the Times attended the conference, and he reported that North, I quote, exposed the pernicious use of glue in the restoration of paintings and encouraged the use of wax, as well as showed X-ray of paintings, and he detailed their values for the restorers, end of quote. So we suppose he talked about consolidation and lining and glue, as well as X-rays. And finally, North was also part of the subcommission which was created to report and conclude on the conference, more specifically in the group on the restoration of paintings and varnish applications. As I said at the beginning of my talk, I wanted to show the impact of science on conservation and how the various advances in the examination of paintings cannot be considered separately from the evolution in the field of conservation. In addition to being a scientist, North was also a paintings conservator, and he worked on many important paintings in London and in the UK, including works by Titian, Manet, Renoir, Mantegna, and Turner. And if you think that pictures of Manet and Renoir and Turner are known as difficult paintings, imagine 100 years ago when they were very young. And what's really interesting is that North published about these works. He was one of the, I think, only restorer that I know at the time who was publishing his treatment reports and explaining what he was doing and why he was doing it a certain way. The need to document carefully what conservators were doing to painting was discussed heavily at the 1930 Rome Conference. And as you can see on these examination and treatment maps for two Titian paintings from the Bridgewater collection, North was taking the documentation seriously and was trying to be as rigorous and transparent as possible. Now, this morning, Paolo already introduced the Pentacoffer method, and I'm glad he did. This, as you can see, this is a newspaper clipping from the Times, and it says, the vapor chamber used by Mr. Kennedy North for the conservation of Titian's painting, Diana and Actaeon at Bridgewater House. This new invention is described by an art critic on another page, and this is just the Pentecoffer method that he adjusted. And so I'm not sure if he's telling the press that he's inventing lots of new things, or if he's just not correcting them. But either way, it makes for quite an interesting read. Anyway, North used the Pentecoffer method, but he adjusted it. And so on this image, you can see his new adjusted method, which is a custom-made zinc box filled with asbestos wool and covered with a glass window to survey the progress of the cleaning. There is a fan with a motor within the sealed box, as well as electric heaters to raise the internal temperature. There are more electric heaters outside the box, this time to warm up the solvents contained in the flasks. And again, rather than just regenerating the varnish on the surface, North was using this as a cleaning method. So you can imagine the amount of solvent and heat that he was using to do this. For those who are not conservators, we are not using this anymore, thankfully. The 1920s and 1930s saw a change in the way conservators approached retouching and varnishing, and I wonder if this is linked to technical analysis and the fact that we were now able to see with X-rays and UV and infrared the interventions of conservators. And I wonder if, in turn, this encouraged conservators to keep a light hand when they were retouching. It sort of kept them in check. Already in the 1920s, they are writing about how a restorer must only retouch the losses and not cover the original paint layer. Well, North takes this a step further, again, by only retouching the cracks in the paint. And I quote, "Except for these, the cracks, no retouching has been done by me. Honorable scars I have left alone," end of quote. There was also a change in the varnishes that were used, going from tinted varnishes to transparent one. And again, North takes this a step further by not using traditional resin-based varnish, but using a paraffin wax as a coating. And he stated the paraffin would stay transparent, is transparent, and would remain so. But that's not really true, again, because the paraffin would go gray and would go opaque, and then it would go very furry, it would go very dusty. And this was actually remarked upon by conservators such as Helmut Ruhmann, who had to clean paintings again after North, I think something like 4 or 5 years after he had cleaned some of these paintings. And finally, I want to end the discussion on North's conservation career by telling you that although North's ideas were modern, there were many of them, they were not always well accepted by his peers, and some of them seem a bit bizarre to us in the context of the 2020s. For example, North used to gild the reverse of paintings after he had lined them. He believed this layer of thin metal would slow down the humidity exchanges. And you can see on this image, this is the reverse from Renoir La Loge, which is in the Courtauld Gallery. And this is, in this case, it's gold paint and not gold leaf. But on this one, this is true gold leaf. North also invented and patented a stretcher with spring tension, which was supposed to regulate the tension the painting was under. However, while the idea was good, the delivery was not as successful. This painting by John Sell Cotman came to the Hamilton Kerr Institute in 2013 for treatment, and the lining was okay, but we had to put the painting on a different stretcher because it was so tight. A colleague of mine compared it to a trampoline. But it's really interesting to see that now, while this particular stretcher with the springs didn't quite work, now we are using a lot of spring stretchers, and I think the latest, most famous example is the Nice Watch at the Rijksmuseum, which has just been restretched on, not exactly this stretcher, but a similar kind of ethos. And so to conclude, I just want to say that one cannot underestimate how the history of the field of technical analysis and conservation are intertwined. It is not possible to consider their advances separately, as these fields have and still are constantly influencing one another. Despite North's lack of formal training, his poise and confidence, along with his knowledge and experience and publications, gave him a natural authority. And despite some uneven results, I believe he had good intentions, and most importantly, a strong desire to modernize the profession. His double career as a scientist and restorer, however controversial, made him an important figure in the 1920s, 1930s London. Thank you.
And now Kamila Klutkiewicz, Aldona Towish, we're going to take us to Polish museums, trapped in the past, Polish museums of the interwar period and new technologies. Thank you.
This one? Okay. Thank you very much for invitation. We are very delighted. Now it's okay. We are very delighted to be here. And I'm going to start with some opening remarks, which are very important to understand the situation of Polish museums in interwar period. In the 19th century, a period of intensive development of museums, the Polish lands, which had been divided since the end of the 18th century between Prussia, Austria, and Russia, saw the creation of primarily private collections, often open to the public, but the Polish Museum, established before 1918, were municipal institutions like in Krakow, Warsaw, Lwów, or belonging to various societies, e.g. scientific societies like in Poznan, in Vilnius. So, in fact, after 1918, the young Polish state began to shape its own cultural policy, also with regard to museums. It should be noted that during this period, there were little emphasis on the importance of the latest technological advances in museums. The weak interest in technological innovations and the opportunities they offered in the work of the museum professional was linked to the pressure on other goals and tasks that were placed on museum institutions. It could be said that these were the primary tasks: setting up an institution often from the ground up, giving it a legal framework, building its seat. The largest and most important Polish museum of the period in Krakow, Poznań, Lviv, Vilnius, and Warsaw developed at varying degrees and rates. One of the main topics of discussion about museums was the question of their headquarters. Before 1918, barely a few edifices dedicated to museum activities had been built on Polish lands. Most museums were housed, and this was the rule also in the interwar period, in buildings originally intended for other purposes like palaces, townhouses, monastery building, etc. And the construction of museum building was often preceded by long discussions and sometimes disputes and changes in the architectural concepts. Museums were supposed to be landmarks of cities to testify to the modernity of the Polish state, such as the National Museum in Warsaw and National Museum in Krakow. Some, such as the Silesian Museum in Katowice, which was built in a region over which Poland and Germany had a conflict after the First World War, had a clear propaganda character. So during the fighting on the fields of the First World War, even before Poland regained its independence, a discussion began in Polish journalism and writing on the state of the museums and the perspectives of their future development. One of the issues discussed was the museum professional skills. According to the postulates expressed, among others, by the numismatist and museologist Marian Gumowski, A museum employee should have a degree in art history. It was also advisable for him to attend a course in museology during his studies. This postulate was difficult to implement, as in the interwar period, museology classes for students of art history were taught in Poland only at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. They were conducted by the director of the Krakow Museum, Felix Kopera, who emphasized the practical dimension of the issue discussed. Although not all graduates of the humanities at Polish universities were able to take a course in museology during their studies, it became the rule in the interwar period for Polish museum staff in major urban centers to receive higher education. The work of a museum professional was regarded as a scientific work. Hence, it was necessary to create the right conditions and tools for the scientific development of museum staff. The basic workshop was a library and a collection of reproductions, photographs, sometimes also plaster cast, and reproductions of objects also in other reproduction techniques which served as a comparative material. The library collection was intended to be a collection of books and studies of a different nature, generally related to the subject matter of the collections held at the institution. In individual museum departments, however, handheld book collections were also established with a very narrow specialization corresponding to the department's profile.
It should be noted that in the interwar period, only a few Polish museums had conservation laboratories. Established in 1879, the National Museum in Krakow carried out basic conservation work almost from the outset. But in this, it was not until 1936 that the first painting conservation studio was opened. It was located in one of the museum's branches and was to be housed in the main building, whose construction began in 1934. The head of the studio was Anna Skadeszanka, an art historian who had been employed a year earlier as a student of the course in technology and conservation of paintings at the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow. During her business trip, she became acquainted with conservation studios in Vienna, Budapest, Zagreb, and Copenhagen. The experience gained help to develop the needs of the workshop in its new premises, which were to be equipped, among other things, with an X-ray machine and a chamber for fumigating artifacts. From 1939 onwards, the laboratory had 2 employees. The work was interrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War. The Greater Poland Museum in Poznań, which took over the building of the German Kaiser Friedrich Museum after Poland regained independence, also had its own workshop. However, no investment was made in new technologies here, relying instead on methods developed at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Initially, the same was true of the National Museum in Warsaw, established in 1960 on the basis of the city's earlier art collections. From 1922, Bogdan Marconi, a graduate of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris and the School of Fine Arts in Warsaw, performed the duties of conservator. In the first few years, the focus was on inventory and housekeeping work. From 1926 onwards, a change in the approach to conservation standards for storing the collection and more serious conservation work can be seen. In the new building planned at the time, next to the library and the administrative department, there was a relatively small room for the conservation studio and separate rooms for drawings, restoration of painting, and the photographic studio, but the completion of these rooms had to wait until 1932. The development of the workshop led by Marconi took place in the mid-30s. At the time, Stanisław Lorenz became the deputy and then the director of the museum, aiming to modernize the traditionally managed institution. From 1935 1934 onwards, the workshop had 2 full-time employees, a conservator of painting and ornamental art monuments, assisted with, when necessary, by a photographer, 2 draughtsmen, and 2 technical staff. In the same year, Marconi established cooperation with the X-ray Institute of the University of Warsaw. He drew his theoretical knowledge from the text of Alain Bourreau and Kurt Welt, 1932, although he was probably interested in the application of X-ray to the conservation of paintings earlier. Marconi made his first X-ray examination in 1935 using the apparatus of the radiological, the X-ray Institute. The subject of the examination was 60th century painting of Madonna and Child, on which the existence of 17th century repaints was found. The photographs taken made it possible to remove the secondary layers and expose the original, well-preserved drawing. The conservation work lasted about 3 months and was the first example in Poland to use of this technology in the conservation of paintings. Marconi definitely went beyond the boundaries set by traditional conservationism. During conservation work, he cooperated with specialists from the analytical department of the Chemical Research Institute in analyzing color samples and with the Institute of Forsenic Research in applying ultraviolet rays. Between 1936 and 1938, the museum purchased a quartz analytical lamp with wood filter on a tripod, a filter with a curvette for ultraviolet rays made by Carl Zeiss, electronic irons with temperature control, a prismatic binocular microscope, a single tube with objective and eyepiece, with illuminating lamp, transformer, and camera mixed flat, a motor-grinded Ritter. The most important acquisition, however, was the Philips Centralix medical X-ray machine with an auto-transformer for changing voltages, purchased in 1937. It was preceded by Marconi's trip to Martin de Wildt workshop in The Hague, where the Polish conservator became acquainted with the equipment necessary for X-ray examinations of works of art. The apparatus purchased by the museum, designed to the horizontal photographs, limited its use to the study of large-scale paintings. In 1938, during conservation work on a medieval triptych, inspired by developments to tomography, Marconi took a moving X-ray picture. This experience inspired him to work on a device that allowed the Centralix camera to be mounted on rails under the ceiling. The construction was carried out by the Polish company Walkowski in Warsaw, but its completion was interrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War. Similar work had been carried out at the National Gallery in London since 1966, but it is difficult to assess whether it had any influence on Marconi, especially as the report of the work was not published until 1940. It was not until the 1946 that Marconi completed the design of the State Art Conservation Workshop in Warsaw.
And for the last part, and for the last part, I'm sorry for the surprise for the team upstairs. And for the last part of our presentation, the question: is it just conservation? So the question of use of new technologies in the attribution of works of art in Poland before Second World War. Although X-ray examinations were primarily for conservation work, modern technology allowed Bogdan Marconi to polemicize or confirm doubts about the attribution expressed by art historians. This was the case with the copy of Raphael's painting, The Holy Family with a Lamp, from the collection of National Museum in Warsaw, dated to the 19th century. The stylistic studies carried out in the 1930s by art historians Michał Walicki and Juliusz Starzyński, dating the painting to the 16th century. And these were confirmed by Marconi on the basis of spectral and microchemical examination of the pigments. However, Marconi's research did not always confirm the attributions ascribed by connoisseurs. During the Second World War, in German-occupied Warsaw, Marconi viewed Landscape with a Mill, attributed to Jacob van Ruysdael, from the private collection of the Kosakowski family. He disputed the painting's attribution, getting into an impassioned argument with one of the family members who owned the canvas. And during the difficult time of the occupation, however, Marconi was unable to use professional apparatus to check his suspicions. The painting, happily, albeit after numerous perturbations, survived the turbulent time of the Second World War and is probably still in the hands of the family. As Andrzej Kosakowski, a descendant of the collectors and creator of the Kosakowski family gallery, wrote in his memoirs in 1981, a number of years after the recovery of the Ruysdaelers, somewhere around 1960, Professor Marconi asked us to lend him the painting because he claimed he wanted to finally examine it thoroughly and check the reliability of the authorship. With all the modern methods of examinations, apparatuses, lamps, laboratories, etc. at his disposal, he was able to make an authentic examination of the painting. Marconi was indeed able to make an authentic appraisal of the painting, which apparently had intrigued him for years. After a few months, the professor ruled there that we were dealing with a very interesting forgery. He concluded that the chemical analysis of the white used in this painting ruled out the authorship of any of the Ruysdaels, but indicated an identity with the white produced and used only by Wilhelm Kobel. Marconi's expert opinion, only oral, as the owners of the painting did not ask for a written expert opinion, was opposed by art historians Tadeusz Jaroszewski and Mirosław Kijowicz, relying on inspection and comparative studies, as well as the so-called nose of the art historian. The further fate of the work, which probably remained in private hands, is right now unknown. But however, the debate over the authorship of a painting dating back to the 1940s shows that the use of the latest technology in the work of art historians did not eliminate the importance of the so-called connoisseur's eyes, and that research using the new technology did not always escape an ambiguous and unquestionable scrutiny. When the results of modern research confirmed the comparativist-based suspicions of art historians, they were accepted unquestioningly by museums professionals. However, when the opposite was the case, modern technology did not always have a conclusive status. Thank you very much.